Hello, everyone. Welcome to Story Shifters. Today, we are going to embark on a journey of interesting stories. Our guest is Professor Stanley Ward, and this is our first episode. What did we talk about today?
So we talked about lots of things. Of course, we talked about the cultural dichotomies. We talked about quite a lot of examples of how those dichotomies work in real life. We also talked about a little bit, at least, how religion plays into things. And of course, the ideas of dealing with people from other cultures in a professional setting. We talked about that a little bit as well. And we also tried to figure out how do we deal with people when we have to face them from different cultures? How do we do it so that we're not going to hurt anyone's feelings? Going to Japan was an absolute culture shock, but I love how they communicated no was very interesting because they wouldn't really say no. Well, individualist cultures tend to like people who do things on their own rather than getting help to do it. So it comes after your name. So I would be Stan Sensei everywhere. Okay, here we go. Here we go. So you're right. First of all, individualists tend to do things for themselves. In both places, people will talk about what they've done or what they're doing or what they're planning to do. Because we have to show I'm achieving things, I'm doing stuff, I'm in the world. And of course, I'm still an American. I still do American things. So I still think sometimes in a way, and I will try to show that, hey, I do know a little more. Don't worry, I'm not going to make dumb jokes about that. At the same time, it means that I understand sometimes why students have difficulties here. So it's a very different world now. And you guys, your generation is going to run into a lot more different people than we did in my generation. They were keeping that part hidden for some reason. So this must be a cultural thing. Now I know.
Professor, could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Okay, so my name is Stanley Ward. Of course, I'm a professor at Corvinus University. In the past, I've worked at different universities in Hungary, in Austria, and in Japan. And during that time, I've done a lot of work with cultural, for example, teaching about different cultures. I also teach communications, and I also have worked with, of course, business and basic business. So that's most of my background. On the side, I've done work in the film industry quite a lot, and I'm also a professional voice actor.
I have read and we heard from you that you have lived in 3 different parts of the world. So how did it happen?
Okay, so of course, I was born in the United States. That's where I started. Obviously, once I became 22 years old, I decided to leave because I had done quite a few things, and I decided it was time to just see the world. So at the time, a friend of mine said, why don't you try going to Japan? Because I had been a teacher, of course. And so I said, okay, I'll try Japan. I went. I loved it, absolutely. Then I basically was working there first as an English teacher, then I worked as a business teacher, then I worked as a manager over the 8-9 years I was in Japan. And then I met a woman who would become my wife. She is not from Hungary, but she has citizenship here. She's Russian. And so we decided we were going to leave Japan. We wanted to go to Europe. And Hungary is basically our compromise.
Something between US and Asia.
Yeah.
Okay. And we know that you are very interested in culture, religions, politics. How did it happen?
Okay, that's actually an even easier story. Basically, when I was in university, I was studying to be an English teacher. That was my first work. However, during that time, a lot of people told me, you probably want to go abroad and teach. That's where the idea came in my mind. And so I started looking at different cultures at that time in literature, things like that. Then I got my first chance to go to Japan, so I took it. It was almost the first country I ever went to, actually, because I had been around a few places around the United States, for example, Canada, Mexico, Caribbean islands. But they are in different ways similar-ish to the United States. So it wasn't that big of a culture shock. But going to Japan was an absolute culture shock. But I loved it, every bit of it.
What did you like?
Mostly just because it was very different than the United States. So it was interesting. For example, people greeted each other differently. They didn't really shake hands. People were, for example, how they communicated no was very interesting because they wouldn't really say no, but they would let you know in different ways that actually you couldn't do something. So I don't want to say it's a very Asian thing because it's not. It was very much in Japan. I've seen it in other cultures, but Japanese really did it in a particular way. And that got me more interested. So I started to study more culture. Once we moved to Hungary, which was maybe 19 years ago now. So I was in Japan for about 9 years, and then we came here to Hungary. Somebody asked me, because of my experience, would I teach a class about Japan, which I did for a little while. And then that got me to another person who asked me, would I teach intercultural communication? The person who used to teach, this was at Corvinus actually as a part-timer. Somebody was teaching it. They had left the university. They needed someone to fill that slot. They said, we know you have lots of cultural background. Yeah, can you come do it? And I said, yeah, I'll give it a try. That started me really deep diving into the topic. And so now, for example, I'm in the Marketing Institute, but I'm in the Department of Intercultural Communication and Consumer Behavior. So I'm talking about culture all the time in that work. And I do it more for the MBA and more for the SEMS programs here. But I also do some as you know, in my ESP class as well. So this is really my form of study. I can also say when I was teaching at ELTE, which is University University here in Hungary, I was teaching American culture. That's the main thing I was teaching. So I've been in the cultural frame for almost 20 years now.
So a lot of experience.
It's up.
One of the things that we learned on the ESP class was the topic of cultural dichotomies.
Yes.
Can you explain more about it?
Yeah, of course. So, okay, there's a couple of researchers who work on this idea that cultures come in sets, let's say. And so the main researcher you have to know is a guy named Hofstede. His cultural dichotomies, which are basically the idea that you have two different kind of cultural frames on either end of a kind of spectrum. So, for example, you'll have individualism on one side and collectivism on another. And so he gave point scores to tell how individualist or how collectivist you were. He then did massive amount of surveys in a whole lot of different countries to find out, for example, are certain people more hierarchical or are they more democratic? Again, are they more collectivist or more individualist? Or, for example, how do they regard time? Though that's more from research from Hall, but that research came into a lot of the stuff that Hofstede was doing as well. So we have these cultural dichotomies, and according to his theory, the main idea is that different cultures fall in different places, understanding that within cultures there are subcultures, and the subcultures can also fall on different parts of that dichotomy. And so the question is, well, what happens in these different dichotomies? We find different things happen culturally or expected culturally. For example, individualist cultures tend to like people who do things on their own rather than getting help to do it. It's not always the case, but it's often the case.
This dichotomies helps you see clearly the difference between cultures. Like before, I didn't notice the difference between Hungarians and the Kazakh people, for example. Mm-hmm. And when I started learning more about it, I noticed that now I see the way how we perceive certain things. Mm-hmm. Can you give certain examples, stories from your own experience about US, Japan, maybe?
There's a lot. There's a lot. I can start with Japan a little. So, for example, Japan is known as a hierarchical culture, but what does that mean in real life practice? So, to give an example, in Japan, if you're a teacher, you have a certain title that everyone calls you. In this case, it's sensei. So it comes after your name. So I would be Stan Sensei everywhere. But the idea was they were marking me as a teacher, and that's a respectful thing. And so I have to be denoted differently than others because, again, it's a hierarchical culture. I can really do this all day. To give another example, even here, for example, in Hungary, Hungarians are now kind of more individualistic minded compared to the past generation, which was more collectivist. Uh-huh. And so there's a difference in how they handle things. Like a modern Hungarian, quote unquote, who's say a young person, probably is more used to doing things on their own. An older Hungarian is more used to calling on family members and friends to try to get things done. To give an example, this even works when you talk about jobs. So, for example, a younger Hungarian might just simply throw around their resume to 100 places. An older Hungarian might ask some friends if they know someone who needs someone for a job. So it's more likely that's what's going to happen. This doesn't say that either one can't use the other way. Of course they do. But younger Hungarians tend to be more individualistic. They tend to do it more on their own. Older Hungarians tend to be more collectivist, and they tend to do it more on their own. Not on their own, but with these networks of people that they know. That's what the two cultures do.
Also, there are certain difference in the way how they perceive time.
Definitely. That's, I believe, more from Hall's work, but the idea is that, for example, coming from my part of the United States, we're all very linear culture people, meaning that we like time to be kind of ordered, designated. We like making plans. We enjoy having things work the way we would like them. In Hungary, they're a little more flexible culture. So they're more willing to, for example, come 5, 10, 20 minutes late to a class. That's much more common, not because they're evil or something strange, but just because a time to start something is not necessarily you have to come on time. However, younger Hungarians, again, are kind of changing now. And I think they're becoming a bit more linear. So I'm finding as the years go on, they're coming to class more and more precisely, for example. It's kind of an interesting change, actually.
I think time management has started as a science from the US, the whole thing, the to-do list and everything. And from Japan, we have Kaizen, I think. Yeah, it's about the linear perception.
I wouldn't say Kaizen's linear. More like Kaizen is within the cyclical time framework, is trying to solve a problem. Because in Kaizen's case, that comes from Toyota. Toyota had the problem where the lower people wouldn't report things to upper people. And so, and they wouldn't tell, for example, problems happening on the factory. So they tried to create a system where everybody has to be involved. Everybody has to give something to discussions. Everyone has to be part of the solution. That's a specific Japanese problem because in Japan, because of its hierarchical culture, the upper level sometimes didn't talk to the lower level. And because of that, there just simply was no communication or very little. So Kaizen tried to fix that problem. Part of Kaizen, yes, is a time element. Like, let's try to keep things in a certain fashion. At the same time, it a little bit fits still the cyclical time culture that we see in Japan, I think, anyway.
And how would you describe Americans with these dichotomies?
I see, for the dichotomies. First of all, if we take the big ones, Americans are definitely individualistic in general.
Why?
Why? There's a lot of theory written on this. One of the theories is that our Protestant background, because we're mostly a Protestant country, created a kind of work ethic. Though I'm not sure if I agree with that idea, but it is there. You'll find quite a lot of Americans either think it or have written about it. Another reason simply seems to be because a lot of American first things were based on agriculture, which usually leads to a cyclical culture. But Americans at that time in the 1700s and 1800s tried to do things in a more scientific way. This was quite in fashion, for example, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so Americans tried to organize everything, including factory work, including farm work. So we became, I think, in a lot of parts of the US, much more linear culture at that time, because we were just trying to organize everything to be as efficient so we could make as much money as possible, simply.
As I understood, individualistic, for example, if you are from individualistic culture, then you would like to achieve something more on an individual level. If you are from communist, then like you should help for your family and so on, yeah?
Okay, here we go. Here we go. So you're right. First of all, individualists tend to do things for themselves. Collectivists tend to do things for their group. However, let's take the collectivist case. Who the group is can change. For example, it might be their family, it might be their company, it might be their group of friends. And this doesn't say that a collectivist person doesn't have their own dreams and wants. The difference is that a collectivist person will put those aside if they think the group needs something. So if they think it's better for the group, and they'll push aside their own desires and do the thing they think the group wants or the group needs. An individualist will think that the group should put aside their things and let them do what they want, if that makes any sense. So individualist wants to do things on their own because they think, if I want to do it, I have to be the one to handle it.
Can you give an example?
Sure. So one example I like to use in class actually is, what do your parents expect you to do when you're an adult, but you haven't moved out yet? In some cultures who tend to be more collectivist, if you're a person, for example, you're 18 years old or older, those cultures expect you to just stay at home. You do it essentially until you get married, or until you really have enough money to move out and live well on your own. In fact, in those kind of cultures, your parents will even help you. For example, they'll buy your first apartment if they can, or they'll help you with the rent if they can't. In individualist culture, however, we expect you to start taking care of yourself as early as possible. So for example, one of my good friends back home, when he turned 18, he didn't decide if he's going to go to university or not. He didn't know if he could do it or pay for it simply. And so his parents said, fine, you can live here, no problem, but you've got to pay rent. You've got to pay utilities. You've got to pay for your own phone, etc. So he did pay part. I mean, of course, they didn't charge him very much because it's their son, but he did it to pay something. And in our culture, this is symbolic. So the amount of money almost doesn't matter. The important part is he's paying, which means that he's showing I can be an independent person. This is me kind of showing my independence. And in exchange, his parents, at least in his case, and this is maybe 30 years ago now, but his parents didn't really push to know what he was doing in his private life. His private life really was his because he was literally paying for his privacy. And that's considered culturally appropriate for us.
And one of the other things was that there were uncertainty avoidance. That
we can talk about it. So basically in cultures, according again to
their theory,
the dichotomies, according to the dichotomies, the idea is that some cultures don't really handle uncertainty very well. They don't like it. They want to avoid it. Uncertainty here means, do we know what's going to happen next if we do X thing? Or uncertainty can be, do we understand what will happen if certain things happen? What's going to be the outcome? In a high uncertainty avoidance culture, they try to avoid that. They want to control things as much as they can so that we don't get bad outcomes. The low uncertainty avoidance culture, of course, is there thinking that, well, probably there won't be bad outcomes, so we don't need to worry about it. So for low uncertainty avoidance, this does not mean low uncertainty avoidance are laid back, because you can have a low uncertainty avoidance culture, which is also very linear in terms of time. But this culture generally thinks, if I do the correct things, things will work out. And they'll work out better. So I don't need to care too deeply about rules. The rules are there, but I don't need to worry about them because it will work.
And can you give example for uncertainty avoidance?
Sure. Japan was the high uncertainty avoidance culture. It's a very kind of, I don't want to say rigid society because that's not true at all, but it does have places where you're not supposed to break the rules. And everybody knows those rules. They're unspoken. For example, if an older person is talking, you don't really talk over them because you're not supposed to. That's one of the rules. And the uncertainty avoidance angle of this is we know that the older person is supposed to talk, so you let them do it. Older person knows this, and there's no case where that won't be true. So at least it's very, very rare. But in terms of deeply in terms of uncertainty avoidance, we're talking about, for example, in Japan, if you want to do anything in the company, there's usually extremely heavily written rules and unwritten rules you must follow. Because the idea is they don't want you to do anything which could upset someone or touch someone else's power or use resources incorrectly in the company. So you've got to follow the rules. There are lots of them. You cannot break them. In Japan, to give you an example, they used to call, whenever you wanted to get permissions, they used to call it inkan hunting. Inkan is a small stick. It's usually used as a stamp in Japan. And so anything official has to have a signature sometimes or a stamp. So if you wanted something to happen, you would take a piece of paper and go to each manager and get them to put their stamp on it. So they called it inkan hunting, and you would hunt for stamps to do anything. So you couldn't do it until you got, the 5 stamps you needed from the 5 bosses. Otherwise, whatever you wanted didn't happen.
What about the culture?
What do you mean?
So we have uncertainty avoidance culture and
low.
Well,
okay, so one low example would be actually part of the United States, the part I'm from. At least it used to be very low uncertainty avoidance. So what that means is, in practical terms, for example, contracts are usually quite small at that time because simply everyone thought it'll probably work out. Don't worry about it. So you don't need thick contracts to do business, basically. Or to give another example, often there are rules, but you can almost always break them a little. To give an example, here's a good example between Hungary and the United States, and Hungary and Japan, actually. Because Hungary is a little bit high in uncertainty avoidance, a little bit. Japan is very high. My part is a little bit low. So in the US, to give an example, if you sign something with a signature, the name of the signature didn't really matter, meaning you could sign it anyway. For example, I have 4 names, my full name. I could write with all 4. I could just write with the 2 that I normally use and not worry about it. In Hungary, you got to do it the same way. And in Japan too, you had to do, so if you have 4 names on your, for example, your passport or identification, you had to use all 4 names. You must. If you don't, because I've had the case happen to me in Hungary and in Japan, if I didn't use all my names, someone would say, we can't do this thing. You have to redo the whole document because you didn't sign correctly. And that's a very, very big deal, actually.
And there was masculine and feminine cultures.
Yes. Now those are a little more...
In terms of values, we talked about them.
Yeah, we did. No, so I was going to say it's a little more ambiguous, these terms, but roughly speaking, masculine culture is quote unquote more heroic. It's more assertive, more aggressive. It's trying to dominate. It's trying to win. So it goes, sorry?
For example?
For example, this is in a masculine culture, if you are on social media, you're supposed to say things about things that you're doing. Like, I just achieved this thing in my work, or I just got this promotion, or I just managed to get married, or I managed to go out and do something. I'm not saying this doesn't happen in the other type of culture, but in a masculine culture, we expect that you're going to yell about those things because they're important. You're showing what you've achieved. And in masculine culture, that's very, very important. So even, for example, when people talk to each other in the different cultures, like say in American culture, which is quite masculine, or say Slovakian culture, which is quite masculine as well. In both places, people will talk about what they've done or what they're doing or what they're planning to do. Because we have to show I'm achieving things, I'm doing stuff, I'm in the world. Now, in a feminine type culture, this culture is more about how is everyone doing in the culture? Are we caring for the weakest people in the culture? Are we planning ahead? So they have usually a much more long-term orientation, which is also one of the things which I did not teach in class, coming from Hofstede. But anyway, they tend to say, are we taking care of everyone? Is everyone okay? And so for example, places like Sweden and Norway, people do, of course, talk about things they're doing, but in Norwegian culture, and to an extent, I believe, Swedish culture, you're not supposed to really yell about what you accomplish. You can do things, but you don't brag about it because you're not supposed to.
How others know about it?
Sorry?
How others know about it?
Well, first of all, there are 100 million guides out there about different cultures. That's a big one because some of these guides are pretty good now, especially nowadays, because there's simply more people writing about things now. The second way to know about it is, well, frankly, there's a lot of reading to do. There's plenty you can study, you can do on your own. And of course, there are occasionally intercultural courses or intercultural communication courses where you can actually learn about, well, what are these different things and how can I interact with them in real life? There's a whole industry who very much wants you to come and study that.
And can you talk about your personal stories from Japan where you noticed that's cultural dichotomies?
Of course. I remember once, just to give an example, when I first got to Japan, I think, there was a case where we were in a conference room. We were meeting with some people, like my little branch that I was a part of. We had some big visitors coming that day. And I remember very carefully them telling me that they have to have a certain chair because that seat at the table was the honorable seat. And that's where the important person goes. And so you have to, so that's an example of a hierarchical type culture because they had to go there. You couldn't put them anywhere else. Another example is, just to give one more, is I remember in Japan always, when I was a manager myself, I had several administrators working for me. And sometimes a problem would happen, and one of them would just say, there's a phrase in Japanese, Skoganai. And this Skoganai means basically, there's nothing we can do about it. Interestingly, this fits in with what we call a cyclical time culture, because in many cyclical time cultures, the events that happen are kind of up to fate, or even up to God. So in Japanese culture, when they would say Shoganai, it just means we can't help it. But the deeper cultural meaning was maybe this wasn't the time. So it didn't work. Too bad. So they wouldn't, I would say, okay, I'm not going to say people didn't get upset about things not happening. They did. But
they wouldn't blame themselves?
They wouldn't really blame themselves because for some people, they really thought that, well, it just wasn't the time. We weren't supposed to try it now. We did, and it failed, see? So we should have waited or should have done it at a different time.
You mentioned that you really like Japan.
I do, of course.
Which, in terms of the dichotomies, can you describe them? Like,
yeah, sure.
What especially you liked?
Well, the thing is that, first of all, the hierarchical part was there. You can take it or leave it. You just dealt with it. In terms of individualism versus collectivism, the collectivism was sometimes useful. For example, I had a case where I once had to go to a hospital. It was just a bad flu, but it was really bad. I had to go to a hospital, and the people in my work actually came and helped me, and like several of them. So they kind of got together and decided, okay, we can help him out. I guess they also felt because I was there at that time as a guest of the company, so they decided they're going to help me. They all got together. They took me to the hospital as a group and actually helped me get through the whole system because, of course, I didn't know what was going on. It's Japan, so I had no idea. So they helped me go through the whole thing. And like as a group, and I've had that group of people were useful later when I started applying for different jobs. They actually, one guy introduced me to another company, even though he was still working at our old company, things like that. Because we had formed a group of friends. And so now we helped each other. That was really, really helpful. Japan is high uncertainty avoidance. Sometimes this is really good because it means they outline all of the rules. So you know exactly what's going to happen. You know how it's going to work. Even if it's unofficial, you can ask people, well, how does this go? And they know. So you don't have to guess what's going to happen next. That part I really like.
And now in Hungary, what do you like about it?
There's a lot of things. But if we talk about the dichotomies, for example, in one sense, as I said, Hungary has a lighter version of the high uncertainty avoidance. This means in Hungary, I'll give you one example. It's a little harder maybe to make friends, like to get close to people and get to know people.
Than in Japan?
Japan, culturally, it was very surface because the question was, who were you connected to? If the answer is not these people, then you may or may not make friends. It depends. In Hungary, I get the feeling that people kind of take their time get to know you. So they don't become your friend immediately, but it takes some time. Once they've decided that you are their friend, you are their friend. And that's it. And they're going to be your friend forever, basically. But it takes some time. get to that point.
Hungarian people are collectivists?
That's an interesting one, because I think the cities in Hungary are much more individualist now, but the countryside is still very collectivist. And I think, again, we can also split this by age. As I've mentioned before, younger people tend to be more individualist, older people tend to be more collectivist. We could say it's because of the past history when they were socialist and so on, but this is the split that I've seen. So there's still, for example, as I said, if you want to hunt for a job in Hungary, it's good to have friends, for example. At the same time, every job I've gotten here, almost, I've done entirely on my own. As in, I've not really had anyone help me. Nobody wanted to push me towards a company. I just got things because I sent out resumes, basically. So you can do both here, actually.
And culture influenced you the most?
Influences me the most. And at this point, I've been in Hungary for a really long time. So it's definitely Hungary. I still have things in my personality that are from Japan, or the fact that I live with a Russian woman. So I do know quite a bit about Russian culture. And of course, it influences me because I hang around Russian people quite a lot, and Ukrainian people, and so on. So this all influences me. Of course, I'm still an American. I still do American things. So I still think sometimes in a way. So it's all mixed in. Good question. I don't know which one is more dominant. I assume Hungarian, just because I'm here, but it's not necessarily the truth.
What was the biggest challenge when you were adapting in Japan?
Probably the biggest thing in Japan was simply that these social cues are different there, like body language, facial expressions. So when a person in Japan smiles at you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they like something. It just means that they're being polite. Mm-hmm. Like they want to make the situation calmer or okay, so they'll smile. Rather than it meaning like they really like whatever's going on and so on. There's a joke by a guy who said once that he was giving a speech in Japan. He was an American guy. He was telling some jokes. And so when he was telling the jokes, that the translator wasn't translating the joke. The translator said something like, hey, this joke is actually really funny, but it's too complicated for me to tell you, so please laugh. And they would do things like that. And people would, ha, 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 it's so funny. But
they didn't understand.
No, they didn't know the joke at all. But the guy said, it's really funny, but I can't tell you, so please laugh now to make you feel good, basically. And so that's a common thing in Japan. They don't want you to feel bad.
They're very polite.
They're very, very polite. And so they will do things, maybe they don't like you, who knows, but they won't really show that.
Americans show. Do they like you or not?
They do. Most Americans do. Though, I should say something. This has changed in American culture, actually. So this is kind of interesting. At least as I perceive it, in the States, we're also becoming more polite in that we want to be maybe more respectful, or at least we want to not hurt your feelings. So, for example, when we speak now, I've noticed, especially in companies who are trying to not make the customers angry, they use certain language now in order to kind of soften everything. So they don't really say things directly sometimes. Like they won't tell you, get out of the room. They'll tell you, excuse me, it'd be very nice if you left right now because of reason, which is probably better. Yeah. But it is different. When I was younger, that wasn't the way it was. So it's the culture is changing. And that's the thing I should say. Culture is always changing, always. So in the States, we used to be very direct. That has changed.
I noticed that when I'm speaking in English, I've become very polite. I say a lot of times, sorry, please, could you, may,
exactly.
And so on. But when I speak, for example, on my native language, on Kazakh language, I am more straightforward.
Definitely. That's because American culture and by extension, all English-speaking culture, I think all of us in Britain, in Australia, Canada, we've all started to kind of soften our language. I know it's happening. So I'm not surprised.
And have you noticed that when you start to learn more about something, for example, you learn a lot about cultures, religions, politics, you start to see things in a more colorful way. You understand things more, why certain people are doing things in certain way.
Of course. That's the reason why I keep trying to study more things, because I notice once I've been exposed to something, then I start to see it. Like I'm studying Hungarian, And I noticed that once I've learned something in Hungarian, I notice it everywhere. Whereas before, my brain never heard it. Now that I know like certain words, they pop up all the time. This is the same for cultural things. So once you've learned about, for example, the cultural dichotomies, you'll see them everywhere, even when you don't want to. You'll see people talking, or you'll be involved in something. You realize these people are individualists. Okay, now I know how to deal with them. Or you'll notice, okay, these people are a bit high uncertainty avoidance. I probably should do X and Y to make them feel more comfortable. You do start to see it kind of everywhere. This goes for religions as well. Once I know what to look for example, I recently had a student actually tell me that they don't want to eat any kind of gummy candy. And it took me a second to realize why. And of course, because some of the stuff is made from pig gelatin. So, and if a Muslim person can't eat products from pigs, and they can't eat candies made from pig gelatin, of course not. It makes perfect sense. But I wouldn't have thought of it before until I realized the student was telling me, and I thought, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's why you're not doing that.
I noticed that when I'm traveling, if I don't know something about the country, then I'm just looking at the buildings and like, wow, it's cool. But when I search something about the country, about the culture and so on, then I noticed. Wow.
Yeah, and that's exactly
that's good.
About. Yeah, you have to study about stuff. If you're going to visit places, you should learn about them a little bit before you go. This is something actually I always do. Before I travel, I try to learn a little bit, at least of the main places I want to see, because it makes you engage. So it's definitely better.
So you said that dichotomies help you to talk with people in a certain way. For example, can you give examples? For example, how you should talk with me. For example, I'm from Kazakhstan. Okay. It's like communist country. I don't know.
Post-communist. It depends, of course, on the details of Kazakh culture. So, for example, if Kazakhs are, let's say, very low context or high context, that will determine how much I say.
What is low context and high context?
So low context, high context, I forgot. Low context, or rather context here means what's the background of the stuff we're saying. So in a low context culture, I assume you have no background in what I'm talking about, or you might not. And because of that, I have to say kind of everything. Whereas in a high context culture, we assume there's some background there. I assume you know something or understand something. So I don't need to dig into detail about it. Because maybe you won't know the exact thing I'm going to say or the exact way I mean, but you can, I think in a high context culture, you can guess it. So I don't need to tell you everything.
And there was an example with a person being hungry. Yeah.
Yes.
That if someone tells you I'm hungry.
Yes. That one's, I use that one because it happened to me. I tend to use things that happen to me. And so I did have a case where the same kind of thing happened in two different cultures where you're talking with a friend. The friend is bored. For example, in this case, it was a security guard job, and he was mega super bored. And so he talked to me, and we were just talking. He should not have done that. That was bad, but he did it. And we were talking, and he was like, "Oh man, I'm really, really hungry." And so I realized that's a cultural split. What should happen? I actually thought very deeply about it, what I should do, because this was in Japan actually. And the friend of mine was he wasn't a security guard. He was working for a security company, and he was doing something where he had to be there at night. So he calls me, I think at like 10 o'clock at night. He knows I'm home, and he's like, "Dude, I'm bored. What should I do?" And he's like, "Oh man, I'm really hungry." And so I thought, well, what does that mean? Because in the States, if someone told me they're really hungry, I would say, "Man, that's too bad." And I would wait for him to tell me what he wants me to do. Because in a low context culture, you should
give orders.
Yeah, in a low context culture, not give orders. It's just that for us low context people, if you don't say it, it doesn't exist. So if you don't tell me, "Go get me some food, I'm hungry," then I'm probably not going to do it because you didn't talk about it. But if you start talking about, "Man, I could go here, or I could order from this place or this place," then you're hinting me, I want to eat something. But if you just say, "Yeah, I'm really hungry," that just means you're hungry. You don't want anything to happen. But in high context culture, my friend telling me that, he was basically saying, "Bring me something, I'm dying." Because he felt really hungry, but he couldn't leave. And in those days, you couldn't really order anything. So you had to go pick it up and take it. So, which is what I did, by the way. So it took me a few minutes to figure it out, to be perfectly honest.
And do you think we are high context or low context people?
Oh, I'm sure you're high context.
What about Russian people? You said that your wife is Russian.
Yes, I did say that. That was my mistake. No, they tend to be, I think they tend to be high context. I think there's parts of the culture that are very straight, like they can tell you things straightly. But at the same time, I've noticed that at least some Russian people seem to worry quite a bit about what everything they're saying. So they don't give lots of details to things. They can, but I don't, at least as far as I see, they don't. However, I'm talking about really the circle of people I know, because those are the ones that I interact with. And some of them are Ukrainian, some of them are Tatar, some of them are other things. So I can't say Russian people, not really.
There was an example about coming home, writing.
Yes. So one of the examples I like to give, because it actually happened, was that once I was asked, what time are you coming home? This is by my wife. And she is, like I said, a high context person. I think Russian culture is high context to an extent. And so I sometimes forget that. And I will sometimes give her an answer that's way too detailed, much more than she needs, because again, in her high context thinking, she already knows the background, maybe a half-second explanation of why. She doesn't need me to go into detail for each step of what I'm going to do. So in that case, she wanted me to say, I'll be home around 7. Or she wanted me to say, I'll be home around the usual time. Nothing strange today. That's it. That's what she wanted. What I told her was, I'll be here at this time at 7 o'clock. Then it'll take me 20 minutes to get to the next place. That'll be 7:20, 7:25. The next train is at 7:30. I'll catch that one. That means I'll get home or I'll actually get to our station at 7:50, and then it takes 5 minutes, and I'll be home exactly at 7:55 or 7:57, which is way too much detail. For someone who's high context, they're probably thinking, why are you telling me this? I know this. I don't need you to tell me all that. For low context people, we think, what if you don't know? What if you don't know each step I have to take? Maybe you don't remember. Maybe you're not thinking about it. I don't know. So I've got to tell you. I think this is, for those two cultures, it can be a problem sometimes to talk to each other, because one is looking for detail. And actually in some low context cultures, like my old culture in the States, if you don't give details, it means you're hiding something, we think. So we think you're trying to hide, which you're trying to keep something from us. In a high context culture, they don't want that much detail about this. Maybe they want to hear about your feelings, or maybe they want to hear about, what did you do next? But they don't care about the background details because they happen. They already are supposed to know.
Were there any misunderstandings because of this cultural dichotomies?
Oh, very. I can tell you one story. And actually, there's a comedian in the States. So I'll use his story because it's pretty good. But basically, he had a case where he was in Japan. He wanted to travel somewhere. And I had a very similar case. And I'll tell my story in a moment. But he wanted to travel somewhere. He asked the train conductor, is there a train to X place? And then in Japanese, the guy says, oh, that's difficult. In Japanese, it's difficult means forget it. You're not going to do it. It's difficult means there's no way. Give up. But he thought, okay, well, it's difficult, but we can try. So as an American, you think, okay, I can try it. This guy was basically saying, there's no chance. And that was a big problem, because one was low context. Because if a low context person, if you don't tell me why it's difficult, I'm going to assume it's possible. It's just difficult.
And what about your example?
I forgot. So my example, I once went to there's a place we call Baskin Robbins, which is an ice cream place. We have it in the States. They have it in Japan. It's called 31 in Japan because it has 31 flavors. Kind of interesting. So anyway, I went to this ice cream place and I asked them, can I have a chocolate sundae? However, that week they were having a promotion for, I think it was strawberry sundaes. So I asked, can I have a chocolate one? The woman behind the counter said, it's difficult. Hold on, this is good. So I look at her and I can see the chocolate sauce behind her. It's on the counter. I say, well, can you use that? It's difficult. This was our conversation for about 5 minutes. I say, can you use the chocolate? She's like, oh, it's really difficult. And then she called in her manager. Her manager came. I said, can I have, I just really wanted chocolate on my ice cream. Can I have it? difficult. And they both told me that.
And you did?
No, I got it. After another 5 minutes of discussion, the woman said, we can give you chocolate, but we have to charge you the price of strawberry. And I said, it's okay. Because their problem was the strawberry price, I think, was slightly higher than the chocolate price for the topping on the ice cream. And so I guess they were just being nice to me and didn't want me to pay more for something that they couldn't give me because they were doing something at the store at that time. Just, I wanted it. So finally they gave it to me. But it took 10 minutes of talking to get that thing.
Oh, to say no to Japanese, you should say it's impossible. Oh, no.
It's difficult.
It's difficult. How has knowledge shaped your understanding of cultures?
Okay, so that's a very wide question.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I mean, of course, because I know now about different cultures, when I have them in class, I'm a little more careful about how I do things. Like if I know someone, for example, a Muslim, and I will try to show that, hey, I do know a little more. Don't worry, I'm not going to make dumb jokes about that. Or if I have someone coming from a certain culture, like and I do have some connection to that culture, I'll try to let them know that, hey, they know a little, so I'm going to take care of you. It's not going to be that I'm going to just say weird things and just toss them around. At the same time, it means that I understand sometimes why students have difficulties here. Like I've been doing some kind of consulting work for the MBA here at Corvinus. This is with different groups doing different projects here, like some MBA groups. And sometimes, because what I'm doing with them is I'm helping them do self-reflection. And so a lot of things that come out in self-reflection, especially in their first semester, because a lot of them are coming from other countries. Hungary is very different. Like some guys will be coming from Ghana, or coming, for example, from Myanmar and so on. And this is a very different place than Ghana or Myanmar. And so they're running into issues here because, of course, Hungarians are not Ghanese or Ghanaian or people from Myanmar. So I sometimes end up just kind of saying, here are the cultural things that are going on. This is why you're reacting this way. Because you're from this culture. For example, maybe you're from a very collectivist culture, but Hungary is not really as collectivist anymore. And especially in the big cities, it's even a little more individualist. That's why you're having problems right now with this. Or I can tell them that, for example, one case, I was telling someone, basically he had a problem because he could never figure out who was in charge of something. But I was telling him, in Hungary, it's actually shifting from a hierarchical culture. It's becoming a bit more democratic. This means that sometimes who's in charge is going to be a little more fluid in company. Because he was working, I think, at a company. He was like part-timing at a company, and it was making him angry that he could never find a boss to be in charge of something. But that wasn't the way the company worked. The company had a certain structure, and that structure was more democratic structure than a hierarchical structure. So he was having like cultural problems with it, actually. Dealing with those people. Okay, so
with the globalization, it's becoming very important to know these things, to know dichotomies, to understand everything.
No, absolutely. As I told you all in class, the world it's now easier to move on. Even though it's getting a little harder these days because people are afraid of terrorism and other things. The fact is that when I went to Japan and came to Hungary, it was very difficult to do it. Now processes are a lot easier. It's a lot clearer how you can do it. And so as you said, we're now becoming a much more global world. We can help each other online. We move around a lot of countries. You yourself are here studying, which would never have happened 15 years ago. It was impossible. Now here you are. So that's a thing that just didn't happen when I first got here. I was the American teacher over at Utrecht University when I first got there. There were like, I think four in the whole place. Now there's a lot more. And I would say the same here at Corvinus. When I came here, there was a small group of us. I think there were maybe 5 or 6 of us, and we all were in the same department. Now we're spread all over the place, and there's a good chunk of us here in the university. But there wasn't when I first got here 15 years ago. There was just nobody, basically. So it's a very different world now. And you guys, your generation is going to run into a lot more different people than we did in my generation. I'm learning how to deal with it. I've learned how to deal with it. I got lucky because I worked in Japan, but I worked with a lot of foreigners. So most of my staff were foreigners, like most of the teaching staff that I were dealing with were foreigners. The administrative staff were Japanese. So we all had to get to know each other and work together. I mean, I work with guys from all different countries. And so I had to learn it. But that's just a special, magical, let's say, lucky thing for me. That didn't happen then. It happens a lot now. Okay.
So can you give one advice for a person to be a better communicator, maybe? There is some person who you don't know. He's from another country, which you also don't know, or how you should escape this issue.
The easiest way, that just depends on culture, obviously. The easiest thing to do is to get the other person talking. Well, if you can get them to talk a bit, you'll see how they communicate. You'll see what kind of things they say and what they don't say. For example, I'll give you an example. In Hungary, often I will ask someone, like they say, oh, I did my internship. So you say, where did you do it? And they'll say, a bank. They don't tell you which bank. They don't tell you where. They just say, a bank. And then they go on. That's a weird little cultural thing, but for a person like me, that bothers me because I want to know which one. But in the people that have had this happen with those Hungarians, they were keeping that part hidden for some reason. Now, I don't want to deeply go into psychology and say why, but they were. But the more I got them to talk, the more I would find these kind of things out. Then I could see, okay, well, this is either their personality, but then I started to see it, a pattern across people. So this must be a cultural thing. Now I know. So I know not to poke at that. For example, I don't want to press, where were you? Because that's not my business, according to their thinking. Simply.
I think that's the end of our episode. It was a very interesting conversation.